Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Mark Krzysko. I'm the Principal Deputy for Acquisition Policy and Innovation. I always mess up that thing. I am very excited to chair this panel today, and very excited to participate in the Acquisition Research Symposium. It is one of my favorite things throughout the year to look forward to, where great minds come together and display their talents, and we learn an awful lot. A special shout out to Rob, Dr. Rindeau, as well as Carrie Schaefer for putting this on. I regret that we can't do this in person, but things are what they are, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to do this. Some of you may know me. In my portfolio as it exists, work on the data and analytics side for the acquisition community, as well as the Acquisition Innovation Research Center and the Defense Civilian Training Corps. So data is core at my heart of how do we improve data, and we have three wonderful topics today and presentations to talk about various segments of that as we go through this. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Waterloo Tsutsui, Dr. Darryl Draper-Amason, I got it wrong, I think, and Mr. Frank Gertner. The first paper is going to be from Dr. Waterloo. He's a senior research associate in School of Aeronautics and Astronautics at Purdue, one of the DCTC schools. And the paper is Balancing Access and Protection, a decision framework for additive manufacturing intellectual property rights in defense acquisition. A very difficult topic to deal with, and I look forward to his presentation here. For Dr. Darryl Draper, I'm going to keep messing this up. Amason, she's a researcher and assistant professor at ODU at Virginia Digital Maritime Center. Her paper is on integrated digital maturity pathway for technical data packages. Dr. Amason is a leading expert in performance improvement, leveraging her PhD in instructional systems to enhance organizational effectiveness. Her research in maturity models, instructional design, and online education has transformed training, effectiveness, and readiness metrics. She specializes in performance improvement frameworks, guiding organizations through transitions and process optimization. And certainly, last but not least, Mr. Frank Gertner. He is the Director of Technology Management Programs at University of Maryland, Robert H. Smith School of Business. And his paper is on time value of data decision modeling for major defense acquisition programs. Mr. Gertner is the Director for Federal and Veterans Affairs and the Director of Technology Management Graduate Programs at the University of Maryland, Robert H. Smith School of Business. Frank's research, teaching, and program development focuses on business to mission enterprise. He founded Maryland's Initiative for Veteran Lifelong Leadership, leads Smith's Future of Government Management Initiative, and co-designed Maryland's first graduate level curriculum in technology management, instructed jointly with UMD's School of Business, Engineering, and Public Policy. A retired aviator and a foreign area officer. I should have said naval aviator. So a little bit of commonality there between my University of Maryland and NavAir here. So without further ado, Waterloo, you're up first, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krzysko. I appreciate it. So if you could pull up my presentation. Okay, great. So today I'd like to talk about a presentation about additive manufacturing intellectual property rights in defense acquisition. And I did research with co-authors from Purdue University and myself, Purdue University Senior Research Associate, funded by Eric. If you go to the next slide, it shows the outline of this today's talk about motivation objectives. I'd like to talk about the framework that we came up with, and I'd like to demonstrate the framework using a vignette, and finally summarize and the future work. And this particular project presentation, there will be a bunch of abbreviations, specifically AM as in additive manufacturing, IP as intellectual property. So those are abbreviations that we'll be using. Next slide shows the motivation and objective of this particular part. And what happened is about 25 years ago, the additive manufacturing became very popular. Originally, it was a polymer. They became metals using a powder methodology. And then now we can even do additive manufacturing ceramics and composite materials. For instance, hypersonic vehicles, people try to additive manufacture hypersonic vehicles. So that's kind of a really trending manufacturing method. And now with the AM, specifically dealing with it, then we recognize sort of a difference in the perspective between the government who seek access versus defense contractors who seek protections. So how we can manage those two different opinions, that becomes a kind of a big issue. Specifically, what is a fair IP compensation becomes a sort of a big issue. So to do this, we want to develop a decision support framework for the IP acquisition while integrating AM into a framework. Next slide shows basically the timeline of this acquisition process in the chronological order. And whatever I'm talking today, it should take place at the supplier negotiation part. I know that the action actually takes place later stage, but anything we're dealing with intellectual property, we have to discuss ahead of time during the supplier negotiation. So that's kind of an important part. This part is when I was dealing with IP cadre from DoD, make sure to point that this needs to take place upfront. And so that's kind of an important point. And next slide shows the framework that we came up with. So step one, we begin with some sort of a scoping activity, scenario scoping. So this part determines whether framework applies to the situation at hand and extract all the relevant information from whatever the use case we're dealing with. And second part, IP asset and IP considerations. This is where we identify reasons why we're doing this, what IP we need to acquire, and how this IP acquisition should be structured. And number three, finally, going to the IP strategy formulation, we consolidate all the informations and create the actionable IP acquisition framework. And I'd like to go through each of the steps. If you go to the next slide, it shows the step one, scenario scoping. So this particular table shows the summary of things that we can look for. And for instance, OEM status, active versus inactive, makes a huge difference in the acquisition process, specifically IP acquisition and how to give a credit. So those things we have to first use this to scope the project. Then move on to the next slide with step 2A. Since we are dealing with an IP asset at different stage of the acquisition, you have a different IP asset to deal with. And in a traditional sense, when we had a traditional manufacturing, we have a basic specification, then everything else could be black box, and we rely on the manufacturer to produce for us. But in additive manufacturing, this centralized manufacturing became decentralized. So essentially, the user and the producer can be the same person. So if that's the case, we need more information about how to make one. So not just for the CAD data, but build information, materials information, how to do post-processing. Post-processing is a very big deal in additive manufacturing because you make one, and specifically when the additive manufactured part is a part of the big system, you have to have a nice surface so they can fit within the system. So post-processing becomes a really big deal. Then testing, the MRO part, maintenance, repair, and operations, and end of life. In case the current model becomes next year's sort of like next year's model, we have to sort of study. So that's why there's additional line from end of life to the design post plan for next processing. And if you go to the next slide, this part shows the IP acquisition consideration: why, what, how. So why, and why essentially means why IP acquisition is necessary. And by assessing cost of inaction, what type of investment do we have to do if you don't acquire IP at this point? That's a big question. And number two, what asset needs to be acquired? What IP asset needs to be acquired? And number three, how to structure the acquisition. So number three can have how to structure the acquisition, when to acquire, and how long the IP needs to be. We have to have that kind of things we have to worry about. Then move on to the step number 3. Step number 3 is basically the consolidation of all the information. And at this point, we basically have multiple different sort of like decision making under uncertainty. So this inspired, we are inspired by what's on the real option theory. So it basically gives flexibility in the decision making process, especially when you have under uncertainty. And the gist of this is we are suggesting that instead of committing to just one rigid approach to acquiring IP, maybe we should develop several carefully defined options that can be included in the contract. And this gives us sort of like flexibility to adapt as circumstances change, and while we are still having a clear strategy in place. So that's what we are trying to suggest in this step number 3. Then move on to the next slide. We're trying to demonstrate our framework. So in this particular vignette that we'll try to discuss, assumption is sometime in the future, we might have some crisis that we need face mask respirator. And to do this, currently we have one manufacturer producing very high quality one, but this manufacturer may not be able to keep up with it. So we have to use additive manufacturing to be able to meet the demand. So that's our requirement. And the problem is this particular OEM alone cannot meet demand. Okay, but other manufacturer may or may not make one. But if this, if what happens? So this kind of difficult case. So the question is, how can we use our additive manufacturing IP framework to prepare an IP acquisition strategy today for this future scenario? So if we wait for this to occur, if you don't prepare anything ahead of time, unfortunately, you're too late. So again, now you have to think about this type of scenario ahead of time during a contract. And now we have to prepare for the future event. So that's what we're saying here. And move on to the next one, step number 1. Scenario assumptions. So I showed a bunch of those scenario features, choices. So we have to answer one by one. For instance, OEM status, currently this manufacturer is active. If this is inactive, obviously you have to make some different cases. And manufacturing currently ongoing means taking place. Sourcing can be multi-source if we want to. And the requirement, for instance, or requirement can be IP required to produce and qualify in the respirators. And mission, this can be a safety of troops, so it's very important. And location can be out of theater, can be somewhere that's not taking place, the war not taking place. And right status, OEM has the all relevant IPs. So those are scenario activities. And move on to the next slide. Next slide shows all the intellectual property that can be considered at each of the different phases. And since we are simply increasing the demand, so demand search rather than the new demand, we don't have to worry about MRO part and end of life particular part. This part we already have a know-how of everything. So, but up to that point, until the testing qualification, we have different type of IP we have to deal with. So that's something we have to consider. Then if you go to the next slide. Next slide shows the right-hand side of figures. That's the exact copy of what we had in the previous slide. So if you click once the mouse, yeah. So sourcing and mission status criticality actually drives the cost of inaction. And if you click once, this particular one results in a moderate dollar spending, I'd say. And non-negligible cost basically exist in case of inaction. And so we have to perceive the framework to determine IP acquisition strategies. And this dollar sign, those are essentially the sort of like a subjective opinion. But at the beginning, obviously, everything is subjective. So we have to make a decision like so. And if you click once, one more time, then next one, when to acquire those three things: OEM status, manufacturing of cost of system, and IP right status, that drives the when to acquire, and click once. And it becomes a future contingency. We don't have to have IP right now, but we will need it if we need it. So this kind of emerging situation, we need IP. So in the case, we have to be able to have more production using different suppliers in the case. And then if you go to next slide shows a bunch of other things. So very similar activities, ownership, scope, acquisition scope, sub-licensing rights, exclusivity. You have to decide all those different dollar figure, et cetera. And at the end of the day, if you go to next slide shows basically a summary of that last step number 3. Left-hand side shows all the summary. And right-hand side, we have to be careful with the sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis means you change your parameters, what happened. And in this case, we are not dealing with actually specific number, but qualitative, we have to worry. For instance, if you look at number 4, if OEM is inactive, meaning that at the very beginning of acquisition, it might be active, but once production starts and you might be dealing with some company that is not very stable and company might go bankrupt. So if that's the case, if that company owns IP ownership, it's very difficult. So we have to consider something called IP or technical data escrow. Just like when you purchase a home, you have a security part. We can put this in escrow. So in case something goes wrong, then DoD can actually retrieve the data for you to manufacture IT manufacture part. So those are the contingency plan that we have to consider right now. Then move on to the next slide. Next slide shows basically the summary of our findings, research overview. Basically, novel approach is I put this greenfield approach because we try not to think existing framework because IT manufacturing is somewhat new. And next one, how do you balance the access to access versus protection? We have to sort of have a flexible IP acquisition strategies. If you set as a rigid format, then no one size fits all. So very difficult for us to deal with different needs of the different companies. So we have to have flexible IP acquisition. And finally, develop a 3-step framework, step 1 to 3, as I explained. Those are the things that I sort of discussed, and that can be a good steps for us to do. And finally, for the next slide, it shows a future work. So future work, I said this integration with the existing framework, and find out a very interesting Thursday last week, May 1st, DoD established what's known as the Intellectual Property Guidebook for DoD acquisition. So if you look at this, it's very interesting. It's somewhat similar to what we discussed. So, but when I did this research, I didn't have this guideline. So maybe we can incorporate what we did and what DoD is now published and find out similarities, et cetera, and maybe we can find out. And portfolio level, everything needs to be high level so we can make a biggest impact on decision. And finally, uncertain risk quantification, I say. Everything has risks. So if you can quantify, that would be best. So that's what we're saying. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the Eric as a sponsor. I really appreciate Eric providing us funding, and we'll continue. We're going to do this research. We were able to do this research. Thank you very much. And that concludes my presentation. Over.
I'll open it up to the floor. If you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A section, and I'll get to them as best I can. Before we move on, a couple quick questions. Was there anything that surprised you in your research that you didn't expect?
So very good. So essentially, no one size fits all. That's the basic idea that sort of applies. And I know this traditional manufacturing was the same way as well. But what happens is when you do IT manufacturing, the user can be the producer, or producer can be user. So that's why if you want to produce a good IT manufacturer part, you have to provide some data. So it means that you have more technical package to deal with, and it means that you have a what do you mean by complete technical data package? I think definition somewhat change. I think that's what surprised me the most, in my opinion.
You alluded to it in terms of the guidebook just being published this week, and for the audience here, I certainly encourage you to go out, reach out, and look at the IP guidebook. And at the end of the day, we're really trying to help program and portfolio managers understand this because they're the ones on the tactical edge. They're the ones buying the goods, the materials, the additive manufacturing. One thing that struck me as a part of your research, if we're talking about one thing, but so often we're system of systems where it's IP upon IP, and that math seems to get very complex in those decision models. If we look at it in one path, it may be one thing. If we look at it as the system of system models, it's a whole different calculus of how risk could be assimilated into strategies there. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know it's not in the core, but
Of course, of course. So the system, you have a very important but difficult point, but eventually someone needs to address it. I'm not saying I'm addressing right now, but you have a component level that IP exists, but then you have a parent level. Eventually, it's like a pyramid type shape. So at the end of the day, some parts made by traditional manufacturing and some people made by additive manufacturing, and who owns what becomes a big problem. And before, when you have a traditional manufacturer part, if one supplier provides everything, it's somewhat simple because everything came as a black box, and this company owns what, you know. But then now we have say for instance, some kind of a ground vehicle, some components owned by different company. Then if somebody on the ground, they actually additive manufactured part, for instance, Ukraine, they may be actually 3D printing their parts. And instead of, they don't have a right material, but they increase the frequency of the maintenance so they don't break down during the operation. So that's what they do, and makes it a little bit difficult to keep track of intellectual property, in my personal opinion. But that's it's a difficult question.
yeah. Yeah, I think intellectual property is just a difficult topic to begin with, and I'm glad we have an IP cadre to address that in the department. But
Great.
thank you. Darryl, I'm gonna go to you now because I am really interested in the topic on the technical data rights. So
Okay. Slides, please. Thank you. So I have been working with Dr. McGrath through the NDIA working group, and I've learned so much from him and the group. So I wanted to share my strategy of maturity or capability, specifically with TDP. So next slide, please. Okay, so our research question was, how can the integrated digital maturity pathway improve TDP completeness, accessibility, security, while respecting contractor intellectual property? And we've had a lot of discussions within the working group, about that, and it can get a little heated as well. Next slide, please. So we have a challenge that was set forth to us in the working group, and I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. So we all know that TDP is critical for life cycle sustainment, and sometimes the data is not complete. There might be in different forms, and so it could be very difficult to get a whole complete package. It's also IP is sensitive, and there's depending on the mixed funding, it can complicate how you can get the TDP. So what we did is we used the NDIA user group, and we conducted a case study. And what we were tasked with was to the whole working group is to come up with user stories that we can kind of focus in on. And as we were going through that process, I was thinking about, well, how can we attack this? Because one of the things that with my experience in manufacturing and performance improvement is that there's a shiny new thing that's out there and everybody wants it, but they don't have an organization to sustain that. And so I took the approach of using a flexible, customizable maturity model to get to that. And hopefully operationalize how you can go about TDP and using that in a more mature way. Next slide, please. Okay, so we had 80 user stories, and we noticed a theme within the user stories that talked about IP rights. And so we decided to break them out. We selected 5 user stories, but 1 or 2 were very similar. So we decided to combine those together. And the user story format is, I am my role. I want to do something so that this can happen. And on the right side of the slide, you'll see that these are the components of the IDMP. We focus in on the user story. Typically, the maturity models start with domains and then processes. I didn't approach it this way. I wanted the human in the loop. I wanted the user story to be the catalyst on how to develop a particular maturity model. So it can be customized to basically any type of context or user story you have. And then what I did was I started identifying current states, capabilities, objectives, risks. We also looked at key decisions that you have to make at each level of maturity. And the idea is that you don't have to be at level 5. It could be that a manufacturer could be at a level 3 and running. It just depends on the environment that they're in. But in addition to that, because I wanted to make sure it would be operationalized, I developed a toolkit. And one is an action planning template. One is an organizational change matrix, as well as a robust risk matrix that go along with it to help support the change in paradigm and how you're approaching things. Next slide, please. So we drilled down into technical data as a service and TDP application. And we used role-based data access. We wanted to make sure it's traceable and modular TDP updates. We applied the maturity model to diagnose and resolve systematic gaps. And we also use the Air Force's Vaultus principles for trustworthiness and interoperability. And then we support the use case specific formats for additive manufacturing and depot repair. That actually was user story number 49, that we had a scenario that we had a cast aluminum part that is broken. What do we do with it? We need the IP so that we can use additive manufacturing to produce it. So that was basically that one user story. Next slide, please. Okay, so for about 6 months, we were working on our user stories, and it culminated in a multiple-day workshop in November, where we all got together and we talked about the four different user stories, and really had a think tank on how as the maturity model guidelines, how can we fine tune it and make it operationalized. And this is kind of a summary photo of, or a diagram of that. And we broke out the individual user stories. They're on the right, left. And then we looked at maturity across the top, and how do you handle TDP within those different scenarios. And you can see that we identified escrow, just as Waterloo had. We identified a number of things, but you'll also see that they're not all at level 5. There are different levels. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's some of the insights and some of the workshop recommendation. So some of the insights that we gleaned from the workshop was that TDP is often procured before sustainment needs are fully known. And I know that Waterloo did touch on that. Contractors resist data sharing due to IP exposure. Government faces delays and costs in spare parts. And then some of the recommendations that we came up with was to apply the IDMP to levels of TDP delivery pathways, use the DRM and blockchain to enhance IP protection at higher maturity levels, prototype TDAS as a business model for secure time-based access to data, and then prioritize 3D PDF and RFP-based data, escrow. And further work with the NDIA right now, we are looking at, we're focusing in on user stories for digital twins, as well as data analytics for Industry 4.0. So those are the things that we're working on. And next slide, please. I want to thank you all for listening in on the presentation.
I'm going to have a couple questions for you too while we're at it. So And one thing, it's not the Air Force and Voltus, it's the chief data officer that told us to all apply Voltus across the
Okay.
data space here. So the Air Force is implementing what big OSD told them to do. And
Okay.
I think that
Oh,
is a
okay.
great model. As I said earlier, Darryl, one of the questions, I'm a data person. Were there natural categories of data models that emerged in the TD, in the technical data packages? Because, in some of the use cases, you're going to have different use cases, and you highlighted two of them there. I always begin with the data first, where there are things that were more natural for others, because not all technical data is going to be the same. Did you find any of that?
Oh, yes, we did. We had tremendous discussions about that and the level of completeness of the technical data packages.
Yeah, because us in the bigger A side of it, more focused on cost, schedule, performance, and technical data feeds into all of that. What we've seen is that we had to put some discipline in the data models, just even in the basic, um, to assess not only the maturity, but the one, did we even get it? Two, was it complete? And we had a rather simple problem associated with that. Technical data packages and the depth associated with it bring on a whole new complexity of how do we need to manage that data as a department, not only from a program but from an enterprise level. To me, it's a fascinating topic, and I think something that we're going to have to continue to work through. Were there
It's
anything?
very complex,
Yeah. Were there
very
things
complex.
that you were surprised by with this?
I think the complexity, because I'm not an expert in TDP. I had done a lot of reading and research on it, but listening to the experiences of the working group. I'm also in the MRL working group. Um, it's just a highly complex, very nuanced subject, and it's going to need you're going to need to have some revision in how that process gets done, depending on if the government is giving funding for a particular part, that's the government's IP. But what happens when you've got a manufacturer that did not have that and they own those rights solely? So it's
Mhm.
and then there's a
Yeah.
flavor spectrum in between. So
Yeah, yeah. Many of these topics become just a comment that I'll make is, you may want to find when you look at if there are subsequent studies associated with this, and then uh, in the work groups, you might want to find one. Don't boil the ocean because TDPs are big, and finding one section to really nook down, so to speak, on all that. Um, whether it
yeah,
be sustainment, find one system and really kind of work and see that, because at some point it becomes, in my world, I think it becomes physics. It can be applied to other disciplines, and maybe it will be different, but finding out that core root problem is always the key here.
yes, it is. And with the IDMP, it's extremely flexible and customizable. It really it depends on the user story. And so coming at it that way, you can get very granular with it.
Yeah. Darryl, we have a question from the audience, and thank you, Heather. Speaking of data, this is Heather's question. Was your finding that the quantity and isolated nature of systems across the services and support agencies exceeded that of the commercial sector? And the second part also, did you find any recommendations for tackling that?
That's yes. I would say yes to that question. And I right now that's what we're going to be working on, is the solution to that.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Frank, I'm going to move over to the University of Maryland and a naval aviator. Over to you, sir. Thank you, Darryl.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be able to present here today on behalf of our UMD B Schools research team, as well as my co-author from our School of Public Policy, Bill Lucerson, who I understand has presented to this forum a number of times before. Yeah, as the title and subtitle for this paper suggest, our paper is the derivative of a project that was sponsored by our UARC here, ARLIS, the Applied Research Lab for Intelligence and Security, for which we were asked to explore DoD's challenge with valuing technical data packages, or TDPs, in contracts for MDAPs. And next slide. So, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, this is not a new challenge, but it's a complex one, and we would offer perhaps an understudied one. That's not to say defense policy and acquisition experts have not been concerned and trying to innovate and doing a lot of great things on how to more efficiently and effectively transact for the parts, the data and IP within major military programs. And I want to be clear up front that our paper and this presentation is not designed to offer any revolutionary breakthroughs or new silver bullets. In fact, a lot of the recommendations that we have and findings align with things, and you'll see references to things like escrows that Waterloo mentioned and TDAS that Darryl mentioned. What we hope it does is provide a more expansive framework that expands the aperture of language and perspective on the problem to invite business and economic scholars who have traditionally focused on private sector challenges, with some parallels perhaps to what we're seeing in DoD, hoping that that broader field of research could be a benefit, down the road and in decision-making by defense policymakers and acquisition professionals. So that hopefully offers some context on our intent, our team, and our approach. We want our contributions to help government policy and acquisition pros, as I mentioned, envision their challenges with MDAP, TDPs, and IP valuation, not just as a DoD problem, but as part of a field of study that is not wholly unique to DoD, while also offering and inviting in those other outside experts to perhaps contribute to solutions. Next slide. So this is the team we collected for the task, and you can see we tried to collect it, as a multidisciplinary team, both from the School of Business as well as the School of Public Policy. And then we did have experts from ARLIS that contributed as well. In fact, I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Mike McGrath, who was also the co-author, I believe, on Darryl's paper, who really was a key advisor in his role with ARLIS. So next slide. On the next slide, we'll talk about, this is just how we tried to summarize or how we tried to frame the paper and our approach. So first, we tried to summarize the challenge along the lines of what I just discussed, but then characterizing it in terms familiar to students of economic and business policy, starting with the concept of a market holdup problem and exploring how holdup problems have been mitigated in private sector industries. And then for phase 3, which is on the next slide, we attempted to discuss the lessons learned from those private sector mitigation techniques to holdups and their potential applications to DoD holdups around specifically technical data package acquisitions. And then we also tried to model a notional decision matrix for DoD acquisition pros to navigate potential approaches. And then finally, we offered some concluding insights and recommendations from our research, perhaps for us to take the next steps, or for others, either in acquisition research fields, or hopefully outside DoD, outside those fields, business and economics researchers to start to lend a hand to tackling this challenge. So let's dive into our thinking on the next slide. Okay, so what is a holdup problem? The theory of holdup problems emerged from the work of Nobel laureate Oliver Williamson, Benjamin Klein, and others in the 1970s and 80s. And it sought to frame challenges and solutions in contractual inefficiencies when effectively when the transactions involve two parties, often within a monopoly or monopsony power dynamic, sometimes within both, right? When you just have a single supplier and a single acquirer. And both parties have to make high stakes valuation decisions upfront, despite information asymmetries around the future. or uncertainties around how market forces will change over the course of contract execution. And so this slide, and I know I apologize that if that chart is a little bit difficult to read, it comes out of one of Williamson's 1979 sort of seminal papers on the problem. But the key thing to take away from the idea of a holdup problem is that clearly within MDAP programs, in particular, very large MDAPs, like say the Columbia class or the Joint Strike Fighter, both DoD and their single supplier are trying to price in market valuations for technical data packages and the parts they represent over the lifespan of the program that could be a half century. And it's just phenomenally difficult for anyone to do that, but it's also not a unique problem to DoD. It's a problem that has been faced by oil markets, by real estate markets, by financial markets, by pharmaceutical markets, and they have developed mitigating techniques. So next slide, please. Okay. So how are they mitigated? Well, while they can be, of course, these problems can be intractable, excuse me, they can be mitigated by governance. And the challenging thing to acknowledge is that governance has to be matched to the particular type of problem that is driving the holdup. And so that's really what we wanted to dive into, was how various holdups and what they're derived from, how that has been approached and mitigated in private sector scenarios historically, as well as now what's evolving in particular markets, and then how we could perhaps import some of those lessons learned into DoD. So on the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about, let's think about DoD holdup problems and where they derived from, right? So as I mentioned, DoD clearly DoD MDAPs can instigate a holdup problem. And there are three reasons that they typically do. One is that the highly specialized nature of the components, right? Just the reality that the components neither exist within an open competitive market, nor likely could they exist within an open competitive market as currently structured. The second is the highly regulatory nature and structure of defense contracting, and the reality that most contracts require pricing upfront on a cost plus model that has to, therefore, requires both sides to evaluate the information at hand, although with an uneven amount of information, and projecting out the potential valuation of a market that's going to change drastically over the likely, both in supply and demand potentially, over the lengthy decades of the program. And then finally, the fact that intellectual property is extremely difficult to manage within a monopsony market. And so what we tried to do is then take that holdup problem and break it down into the three potential or three types of holdup that DoD typically will face within MDAPs, at least from sort of an economics perspective. And we classified the type of holdup by what is instigating the holdup, or the prime factor instigating the holdup. So we characterize three categories. So one category is the product itself. So the product or the tool or the TDP that is being used is so highly specific that it will never be transacted in an open market. There will never be another potential supplier or potential for demand. So think about sort of parts associated with nuclear weapons or some other highly classified components of a particular asset or program. The second potential instigator of the holdup could be the process of DoD contracting in and of itself, right? So perhaps the product or the part or that the TDP is associated with could be transacted in an open market, but the process through which DoD contracting requires it to be transacted constrains the ability to consider valuation beyond the bilateral relationship of the contract. And then the third one, and we would call that a process holdup. And then the third type of holdup would be what we would call an intermediate market holdup or an intermediate conditions holdup. So what does that mean? That means that currently today, there would be no alternative way to supply the product or the tool. But theoretically, over the course of the program, there could emerge a new way to supply the tool, or there could emerge new suppliers, or perhaps even new customers. And therefore, within the current market, you have a monopoly, monopsony holdup. But perhaps 10 years or 15 years down the road, the market could conceivably change. And so we would call that an intermediate market holdup. Next slide. So what are the solutions to these three types of holdup problems that we see in the private sector? And we identified three mitigating solutions that the private sector has used quite effectively. The first, predominantly for intermediate holdups in the market, are real options. And we talk a lot about real options, of course, within DoD. We've had fewer cases of actually using them, in which we can study their impact. But the private sector, in both tangible and intangible asset markets, has really gravitated towards the use of real options. And the way to think about real options as a mitigating technique within an intermediate conditions holdup is that the real option affords both parties, in fact, it requires both parties to contemplate a future date, which within sort of a Black-Scholes model would be called a time until expiration. They both have to agree to a future date and think about alternative pricing under separate market conditions at that future date. And so it requires both parties to think about the future and reduce their information asymmetries and assumption asymmetries about the future by agreeing to a future, what they would call strike price, right? And so you can think about that as an off-ramp along the path to the future, of the contractual timeline. And so not within this paper, but within the ARLIS research, we dove into specific cases in both real estate as well as currencies, both hard currencies and digital currencies, on the use of options. Next slide, please. So the second mitigating technique is IP pooling, and this is largely for for process-driven holdups. And so in this case, we looked at how IP pooling has been used, specifically externally governed IP governance regimes, how it's been used in vaccine markets, as well as some other film industries earlier. This is where the concept of escrows come in. Next slide, please. And then the third one, which is kind of in between the two, is the concept of what oftentimes is, in other markets has been referred to as sort of shifting the process, if you will, from transactions of an asset to transactions of service. And so this is where the idea of tech data as a service, modeling sort of software as a service, procedures or processes, breaks a holdup within the scenario. Next slide. So what are the implications? How would this be applied to DoD? Can it be applied to DoD? And we do believe, in fact, it can be applied to DoD. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll go quickly through this. But the bottom line is that we could have an MDAP. You can envision, I think, a real option holdup mitigation for intermediate condition holdups within DoD. The challenge is that we don't have a market. We don't have an open market within which to contemplate valuation. And so you just have to find proxies for that, right? Proxies for certainly the time to expiration would be similar, but you need proxies for the potential for changes to demand, changes to supply, and changes to technology and technological capabilities for supply over the course of your program. And so we try to model out or notionally discuss what those potential pricing variables could be. Next slide. Okay. And I'm out of time, so I'm happy to discuss any of the other options and their applications within the paper. But the bottom line is that I will just wrap up by saying that we did present in the paper also sort of a three-dimensional decision matrix by which we think DoD could contemplate individualized contracting and options pricing or IP pooling for parts and their TDPs. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank, before I let you go here, there is a question from the audience and marking our time, and we are going to 45. So we have a little bit of time for questions and answers, and I'd strongly encourage the audience, all of you, I had the numbers here a minute ago, 75 out there, so I encourage questions. Frank, this is from John King. Great discussion about the vulnerabilities within the acquisition process. How do you get the requirements out to the warfighter faster, keeping in mind that the Ukrainians are doing this during the war?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And I think in part, especially within major defense acquisition programs, we see a lot of potential within IP pooling arrangements in particular. And the reason that we see a lot of potential within this is that IP pooling was really for the first time used by the US government in the mRNA operation, in the mRNA development of vaccines, right, for the COVID vaccine. And what IP pooling allows you to do is take the competition out of the equation around IP pooling with multiple, with multiple parties. And so where I think that when you think about things like, the IP associated with smaller components and components that need to be developed incredibly quickly, a third-party governance of an IP pool would very rapidly allow more suppliers to access IP along shared usage and royalty regimes, and therefore enable then more rapid production and acquisition and movement to the warfighter. Now, how do you, is that applicable to Columbia class or JSF, level MDAPs? I don't know. That's a much more difficult, problem set to approach. But we came out of the study feeling IP pooling is something that we really need to look much more creatively at.
So I know it's fresh out in the IP policy guidance. I always think about, well, what do we want our programs and contracting officers to do? Not only look at the problem, but figure out how we would implement to tackle some of these or test these. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know the guidance is just fresh, and I am not the deep one on intellectual property and everything that's in that guidance as well either. But what would your thoughts there? Because at some point we got to tell our programs, our services, and our components to do that.
No, it's a great. So first off, I think that we are fortunate. I mean, we believe that all authorities exist within the DFARS and OTA authorities to actually create an IP pool today, if we wanted to. And we explore three different possibilities within our paper. One would be to establish a DoD office tasked to actually pool and share IP and TDP maintenance across all phases of an MDAP, right? And that would be likely have to be a joint office. The second is a nonprofit OTA consortium, and we think that that could easily be modeled on the DIB consortium that already exists. And so in that case, there would be a nonprofit established to manage the data rights and TDPs across DoD enterprises. And then the third one would be delegation of an external authority or a delegation to a commercial vendor, and to require within MDAPS a IP TDP escrow governed by an external vendor. I think that, I mean, I'm most drawn to the idea of the nonprofit OTA consortium. I think that would be, you know, that would be something really interesting to see developed, but that's kind of where we landed.
Okay. Frank, I got another question for you from Lieutenant Colonel Seth Deaton from the Marine Corps. Frank, I like the option pricing. Seems analogous to cost-plus contracts using licensing. Could DoD programs license IP for 100 years with options to reprice every decade if the program becomes more or less valuable to DoD over time?
No, great. Well, thank you for that comment. I do, you know, the one thing that probably the key thing that we came away, the key, you know, recommendation that we came away from our research with is that if there's one thing we could do to break open the door to more effective options pricing, it's to start to back away wherever possible from cost plus pricing requirements. And, you know, again, the DFARS allows experimentation beyond cost plus pricing. But if you stay within the constraints of cost plus pricing in an initial contract, then even an options contract, you're just spreading the paint over a longer time period, right? You're spreading the same amount of pricing over a longer time period. At some point, we've got to move to a more market dynamic pricing model. And it's not going to be perfect. And it's not going to be nearly as mathematical as, say, financial markets are able to option, acquisition of currencies. But because we don't have a stock market, we don't have beta, we don't have other, variables to look at that the market is setting the price on. But there are some really interesting tools out there that can start to allow us to price in even emerging pre-competitive markets. And so, you know, there are new platforms like, PitchBook online or Public Spend Forum. I mean, I'm not advocating for particular platforms, but there are platforms out there that would allow DoD acquisition professionals to cost in the potential, for new supply options as well as new technology in a market, to price that into current pricing calculus, independent of the manufacturer, and would allow us to start to back away from or back out of the holdup that we have in many cases forced by cost plus pricing models that are fully dependent on the supplier.
Thank you. A bit of a comment after that. Certainly, as you indicate, the DFAR allows that. I would say even more broadly, many of our organizations in the department have encouraged that degree of experimentation. You know, whether it be through the Navy Postgraduate School and students and their projects that they work there, as well as other academic, and it has been a bias in the Acquisition Innovation Research Center. Not only take it from esoteric discussions and look at the research, do strong research fundamentals, but give it a go. Find a place to try it. Because often, I don't know, I have found over my career in policy and operations, it exists, but nobody quite knows how to apply it because they are words on a piece of paper, and then you almost have to roll up your sleeves and get your hands a little dirty as you go through that to do that. So I strongly encourage the audience to think about it in those terms and realize there's many organizations across the department that can help you think through that. We don't need to boil the ocean on everything, and there's not manna coming from heaven in terms of policy guidance or the perfect how-to. Our programs are all unique in so many ways in the conditions, and it is hard. It is complex, and it's something we need to go through. Certainly looking at time here, we got a few more minutes here. Challenging the audience to put some questions in here because I think we've just covered the ones in here. But Frank, I'm going to give you a breath here. I'm going to go back to Waterloo here for a minute and see. Same thing there too with additive manufacturing. You think about it in terms of intellectual property. Our systems are complex. It's not just a one-off, and how we do that. And I really almost want to poke at that because it is hard, and it's not just the intellectual property. Sometimes our processes influence what we do in that. I was out there at Navy Postgraduate School a few years ago when we could travel post-COVID and pre-travel shutdown here, where, just getting the approval for a part was, and we didn't need the intellectual property. They needed to fly the plane back from A to B once, not 4,000 times. Did you come across that in terms of intellectual property is one thing, but are there other influences that may influence your model here? Waterloo.
Interesting question. Other models.
I'm gonna give you hard questions now. No one else is, so.
So at the end of the day, when you have a producer and consumer, the sort of the same kind of people, then you only use one product only once, etc. I say it's a difficult question. I say I didn't come across those questions, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I don't mean to get you all really flat-footed here, and I know I'm pushing it well beyond the research here, but that's kind of the way I roll most days here. I think it's important to understand that because ultimately, the people that are in this audience, the students, those who are program managers in the acquisition community, what do I do? It is a very simple axiom in their mind is they're dealing with very complex problems and oftentimes don't have the time to pursue all the pieces here. So, intellectual property is associated with goods that are downrange 10 years may not even be on their watch. And understanding how those models can affect us, not only in the near term, but in the long term, I think are critically important. And I really do want to applaud your research here. I'm going to do a bit of a lightning round here too. And I'm going to focus on program managers, the components. I'll ask each one of the members, what do you want them to do? So program managers, portfolio managers in the services, as well as the components in and of themselves. I'm going to start with you, Darryl, because you've been off mic here for a while, and I want to be sure you're still part of it. What would you tell them to do? How can they benefit from your research here?
Well, looking at having them evaluate themselves to see where they are on the spectrum, how capable they are, and finding that where they want. So you've got that gap, and then using my tool or a tool to start systematically working toward that ultimate goal. So I would do a gap analysis and go from there.
Yeah, good. All right, because they're trying to do their jobs on a day-to-day basis. Frank, what'd you tell them? You got a bunch of contracting officers here. You got program managers in the audience here. Point them to the DFAR. Where would they begin?
More than anything, I'd like them to use their authorities to experiment and then adjust. I think that there are so many authorities out there that Congress has given. There are authorities that have translated into the DFARs. And unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps they're not incentivized. In many cases, perhaps they're not informed enough or trained enough to experiment with new approaches. But I also would love to invite them to reach outside of their discipline and look for help in crafting that experimentation, because there are a lot of people that would love to help experiment and study in this space. And I think that further dialogue is welcome.
Okay.
If I can also
Waterloo, I'm coming to you. Go for it.
I can add, I know that establishing cross-functional team is very important early stage. And what I found when I was doing research was I consulted IP cadre every week. In fact, I invited 1 or 2 people from IP cadre. They are very, very knowledgeable about the entire process. So I say invite IP cadre as soon as possible. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong recommendation. Been exposed a lot when certainly Richard Gray has now departed the pattern, but it was when it was under his tutelage there, a great bunch of talent in IP of how to make this better. So reach out if you're in this audience, or if you extend to this audience there. There are assets, resources, they're here to help. I always like saying, hi, we're from OSD, we're here to help. No, we really are at the policy. We're just not cranking things out and pushing this. For each one of these studies, I know Navy Postgraduate School will post it in their proceedings. Are they also going up on DTIC too, as a part of their catalog, your research? To anyone? The answer should be yes. I know it will be. Frank, I'm gonna dovetail off one, because you touched on a topic, and it's not the topic of this. It's about people. And I think this is why this forum, I've been a fan for decades here of the Navy Postgraduate School and the acquisition forum here. How do we, it's not only incentive for people. Our public servants are certainly some of the best on the planet in what they do in a very difficult space. And navigating law, policy, regulation, timelines, and moving targets often. Eric did a study on what incentivizes this, and I would strongly encourage our program managers, our contracting officers, our acquisition professionals at large, to think about how to make it better. In this administration, we see a lot of pressure on us to improve and lighten the load in terms of policy, process, because it begins and ends in, are we deploying that equipment? Are we maintaining it? Are we getting it out to our war fighters who need it rapidly? There have been things that have demonstrated over the past few decades now, or certainly over the past decade, of adjudicating wars in the Ukraine, the vaccines were touched on. All these tools and techniques are emerging, whether they're adaptive frameworks, whether they are additive manufacturing, whether they're interesting pricing models and business deals. It's not just about engineering. We have to buy it, we have to deploy it, we have to sustain it, we have to manage it. And I think forums like this are really strong associated with that. So I think I got 7 minutes left here. I'm done. I guess my last comment is just for this and for the audience, the few that are here, this will be my last official Navy Postgraduate School, because I will be retiring at the end of the month. It's been a great pleasure to serve with the Navy Postgraduate School and colleagues. And, I hope maybe in a different capacity, I could make the trip out to Monterey next year. I always found that visit and the work of the researchers, the work of the Navy, the work of OSD has been critically important. And we are a community, and we're a very strong community, and I think collaboration is key. And with that, I'll end, and I'll turn it over to the host and say, because you got 6 minutes of dead air, so to speak. Yes.
Mark, there's a question.
Oh, sorry. I went to the chat. Sorry, Q&A. Let me go back to that. Oh, Keith Wright, Captain. Good morning. I have a question on the integration of different programs' IPs. Is something comes under the government through escrow? Has your research seen things be applied to other systems? Will there be problems with who now owns the IP if they are merged?
So I guess I'll offer that we did not find any case in which we've done. I think what Captain Wright is asking about is moving from escrow to IP pooling, across programmatic IP sharing, and that of course would require a governance regime that was worked out with suppliers as well as the program management offices. We did not find any evidence that we've attempted that. But certainly escrow has been experimented with at this point.
Okay.
I didn't see it either, but essentially you provide the third party your technical data plan. Important things I learned is software, because nowadays computers run by software. All those things I give. And generally the condition was if the company goes bankrupt. That's kind of a sort of big one. Now the question was about specifically if they're merged. I did not see actually the specific case, but it goes to probably whoever they merged into one company. So this one company that's has the previous company's intellectual property, I think that goes with it. But I'm not here to sort of provide IP consultation or anything as an attorney, because I'm not an attorney. So that particular part, I think the question needs to go to IP cadre, in my personal opinion. Thank you.
Anything else? Well, let me thank the panelists here. It's covered a wide range of very difficult topics, everything from pricing to how frameworks can be applied to additive manufacturing and getting this. These are thorny problems, and I want to thank you and applaud your research, and certainly encourage you to keep pushing at it so we could have a few things going on with that.